German officers who fought through the Ardennes in December 1944 kept filing a version of the same strange report. A machine gun position would take fire from an angle it shouldn't have, from men who, by every rule of German training, should have broken the moment their officer went down. Instead, they kept moving, splitting off in twos and threes, someone crawling into a ditch, someone else shifting to cover a flank. No shouting, no visible signal, nobody obviously in charge. More than one German captain, watching this through field glasses that winter, is recorded asking almost the identical question of the man next to him: who is commanding these Americans? I'm opening with that composite scene rather than a single named captain. The version of this story that circulates online usually invents one specific officer with a specific name. To make the moment feel more vivid, I'd rather you know up front that the observation itself is real, repeated across multiple German after-action accounts, even though no single clean scene like it survives attached to one identified man. That question, who is commanding these men, is the one this whole story turns on, because the army asking it had, by any honest measure, invented the answer more than a century earlier. The doctrine had a name: Auftragstaktik, usually translated as mission tactics. Tell a subordinate what you need accomplished. Never tell him exactly how. Trust him to work out the rest. German officers had trained on this idea for well over 100 years. They had used it to conquer France in 6 weeks, and pushed to the gates of Moscow in 5 months. And by the autumn of 1944, watching American squads operate without any visible chain of command, they recognized a significant number of them could no longer explain what they were looking at. Not because the Americans had invented something new, but because the Germans had, by then, quietly lost the ability to practice at scale the very thing they'd spent a century teaching. To understand why a German officer in the Ardennes couldn't identify who was giving orders to a 12-man American squad, you have to go back not to D-Day, and not even to America's entry into the war, but to a single catastrophic Prussian afternoon in 1806. On October 14th that year, Napoleon destroyed the Prussian army at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt. It wasn't a defeat so much as an annihilation. The most rigidly drilled army in Europe, built around Frederick the Great's parade ground precision, met an enemy trained to think on its feet and simply came apart. Roughly 25,000 Prussian casualties in a single day. The fortress at Magdeburg surrendered without firing a shot, because its commander couldn't get authorization from a king whose government had effectively stopped functioning. In the wreckage, the Prussian officer corps reached a genuinely uncomfortable conclusion. They had trained their men to wait for orders. Napoleon's officers had been trained to think. When the battlefield situation shifted, a Prussian colonel froze while a French marshal simply acted. Rather than defend the old system, Prussia's reformers decided to copy exactly what had just destroyed them. The men at the center of that reform were Gerhard von Scharnhorst and his protege, Karl von Clausewitz, who would go on to write the book every serious military professional on earth still argues over. Together, they tore the Prussian army apart and rebuilt it around a different premise entirely. War is chaos. No plan survives contact with the enemy. The man at the top can never know what's happening at the bottom fast enough to react in time. So instead of trying, you give the man at the bottom a clear sense of why he's fighting and what result his commander actually wants, and you get out of his way. It took roughly 60 years and several more wars to fully mature. By the time Helmuth von Moltke the Elder took command of the Prussian army in the 1860s, the idea had a settled doctrine and a name. An order that can be misunderstood, Moltke wrote, will be misunderstood. So don't give detailed orders, give intent. Give the outcome you want, then get out of the way of the man who has to deliver it. There's a story every German officer cadet learned for generations that captures the whole philosophy in a single exchange. Prince Frederick Charles of Prussia was reportedly reprimanding a major for a tactical error made during maneuvers. The major protested that he'd only been following orders. The prince's answer has survived as close to doctrine as an anecdote gets. His Majesty made you a major because he believed you would know when not to obey his orders. That's the actual heart of the German military tradition that would go on to conquer most of Europe by 1940. The precise opposite of the rigid, heel-clicking automaton image post-war films would later attach to German soldiers. The doctrine German officers were genuinely trained in held that an order which no longer fit the situation in front of you wasn't binding at all. You were obligated to disregard it and accomplish whatever the order had actually been meant to achieve. By 1933, this had been codified into a manual called Truppenführung, troop leadership, still studied today as one of the more remarkable military texts ever written, stating plainly that war is the realm of friction and uncertainty, that the commander on the spot must be free to decide. That initiative is the duty of every officer and NCO, and that hesitation is a worse sin than a wrong decision actively taken. When the Wehrmacht crashed into Poland in September 1939, the doctrine got its first real test, and American military analysts studying the campaign afterward produced a report that's been quoted in doctrine papers ever since, noting that German commanders had developed initiative through years of deliberate preparation, and that officers at every level felt genuinely free to carry out their missions with minimal interference from above. American officers read that report, circulated it, and then most of them filed it away and went back to drilling soldiers in parade ground formations. When France fell 6 weeks after the German invasion in May 1940, the wider world got to see Auftragstaktik at its actual peak. Rommel, then a divisional commander, was at one point found 50 kilometers ahead of his own headquarters, because he genuinely believed his job was to be wherever the situation was changing fastest. German junior officers tore across northern France, making their own real-time calls about which roads to take and which bridges to seize, while French commanders operated on a decision cycle that could take 24 hours to turn a single frontline observation into an actual order, permanently fighting yesterday's battle. That was the Army American troops, first met in February 1943, in the mountain passes around Kasserine in Tunisia. American officers had read the report on Poland. They knew on paper exactly what they were up against. It didn't save them. Kasserine remains the worst single defeat the United States Army suffered anywhere on the Western Front in the entire war. Roughly 6,500 men lost in 5 days, more than 200 tanks destroyed or abandoned, American forces scattered across 30 miles of desert. German commanders looked at the wreckage and drew the conclusion their own intelligence had been feeding them for 2 years. The Americans had factories, not soldiers, wealth, not warriors. Wehrmacht slang for the American army at that point translates roughly as the dollar army, and it wasn't a compliment. Hold on to that image because it's what makes the rest of this story genuinely strange. 18 months after Kasserine, in the hedgerows of Normandy and the snowfields of the Ardennes, that same German confusion would surface again and again. What actually changed in 18 months is the real question here, and the first real piece of the answer arrived on a beach in Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944, when an entire American assault company lost nearly all of its officers within 10 minutes and did something German defenders had no doctrinal category for at all. 6:30 in the morning, the first wave of Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, the Stonewallers, tracing their lineage back to the Confederate brigade Stonewall Jackson once commanded, came down the ramps of their landing craft into a kill zone German planners had spent 3 years designing. The official Army historian's account of what happened next is one of the starkest documents in the entire institutional record of the U.S. military. Within 10 minutes of the ramps dropping, the company had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Every officer was a casualty. Every sergeant was a casualty. The men still able to move were pinned in the surf, behind beach obstacles, behind the bodies of men who died beside them, or crawled up against the small shingle seawall running along the back of the beach, held there by interlocking machine gun fire from the bluffs above. By every German assumption about American conscripts, what should have happened next was simple. A training memo circulated to the defending garrisons specifically predicted that American soldiers would not function without their officers, that decapitating the leadership would collapse the unit. That isn't what happened. What actually unfolded along 5 miles of Omaha that morning ranks among the more extraordinary collective acts of small unit improvisation in the history of warfare. Groups of 2 and 3 and 5 and 10 men, with no orders, no plan, and no contact with anyone above them, independently reached almost the identical conclusion within minutes of each other. Staying on the beach meant dying on the beach. Somebody had to lead. And in their own small piece of that 5-mile line, the somebody was going to have to be them. The historian Stephen Ambrose recorded one version of it in his D-Day oral history. Sergeant Bob Slaughter of the 116th, pinned in the shingle, watched a lieutenant named Leo von de Voort, not his own platoon leader, not a man he'd taken orders from an hour earlier, stand straight up and say, in words that would circulate through the 29th Division for years afterward, that there wasn't any use staying there, that they were all going to get killed anyway. Von de Voort then ran directly at a German gun emplacement and put a grenade through the firing slit himself, without asking anyone's permission, without waiting for authorization. And the men around him, who had every institutional excuse available to stay exactly where they were, got up and followed him instead. It happened again and again along that same beach. Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota, assistant commander of the 29th Division, came ashore in the second wave and walked through the chaos as though strolling down a country lane, personally reorganizing groups of leaderless men through sheer force of presence. Finding a knot of Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion pinned behind the seawall, he's credited with the line that unit would later adopt as its own official motto: Rangers, lead the way. Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, commanding those same 5th Rangers, had already made an even more consequential call on his own authority. His battalion had been ordered to land at Pointe du Hoc to reinforce the cliff assault there, but with the guide boat lost and that objective already effectively decided, Schneider diverted his entire battalion 1,000 yards east to a less heavily defended stretch of Omaha instead. A decision credited with saving something on the order of 400 of his own men, made without asking anyone's permission and without waiting for new orders to arrive. But the moment that unsettled German officers, once they began debriefing captured Americans months later, wasn't the generals or the colonels improvising. Every army has senior officers capable of that. It was what was happening at the level of privates. Private First Class Carlton Barrett of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, 25 years old, a laborer from upstate New York before the war with no special training and no rank to speak of, landed in deep water under fire, and rather than trying to save himself, spent the rest of that morning swimming back into the surf repeatedly to drag wounded men to shore. Nobody ordered him to do it. Nobody could have. The chain of command around him had already stopped functioning in any conventional sense. He looked at what the situation required and did it, and received the Medal of Honor for those hours, one of only 3 awarded for actions on Omaha that day. Elsewhere on the same beach, an unnamed private from F Company of the 116th looked at the seawall, looked at the bluff above it, looked at the men around him, and simply stood up and started climbing. And other men, from 3 different platoons that morning, followed a man who hadn't been anyone's leader an hour earlier and wouldn't be again 2 days later. There are, by the Army's own official count, dozens of comparable moments scattered across Omaha that single morning. None of them were ordered. None came from a plan. They came from individual men in individual fragments of a broken line, deciding on the spot to do something they hadn't been formally authorized to do. American intelligence officers debriefing captured Germans that summer noticed something odd about their questions. The prisoners kept asking who had been in command of those small units at Omaha. Not for a name, it turned out, but for a category, a slot in the chain of command they could file the answer under. That's what makes the next part of the story genuinely strange. By July 1944, in the Bocage country of the Normandy interior, earthen banks 4 feet high, topped with hedges and trees running up to 15 feet, dividing the countryside into tiny rectangular fields barely 300 feet across. Root systems driven 3 to 12 feet deep, each embankment effectively its own small fortification. German defenders did exactly what the terrain rewarded, turning every single field into an isolated kill zone. What followed between roughly June 12th and July 25th rarely makes it into the highlight reels of the war. No Panzer charges, no 1,000-bomber raids, just 10,000 small, brutal fights in 10,000 small fields, American and German squads who often couldn't see each other until they were close enough to hear one another breathing. The American advance slowed to something like a mile a day, at a casualty rate that in some divisions ran worse per yard of ground than anything recorded in the First World War. German junior officers writing reports during that stretch kept describing the identical phenomenon. A machine gun team would set up behind a hedge bank, take fire from an angle they couldn't immediately place, shift to answer it, and take fire from the opposite flank from a position they hadn't anticipated at all, then find themselves cut off from the rear entirely by a third American group that had somehow infiltrated a hedgerow 100 meters behind them. By the time they understood what was actually happening, they were dead or surrendering. I think what actually mattered in the Bocage wasn't any single dramatic act, the way Van de Voort's grenade or Barrett's rescues had been on Omaha. It was the sheer, grinding repetition of ordinary squads solving the same tactical puzzle independently, field after field, without any two of them ever coordinating on how. That habit had never been written down as American doctrine because it never needed to be. It was something the men had brought with them from somewhere else entirely, and Sergeant Curtis Cullen's story shows the same underlying pattern at a completely different scale. Before the war, Cullen had worked as a sales promotion assistant for a liquor distributor in Cranford, New Jersey. No engineering background, 29 years old, a quiet man with a habit of listening to complaints and then producing something useful about it a few days later. The complaint he was listening to in early July 1944 was the Bocage itself, specifically the way an American Sherman trying to climb over a hedge bank exposed its thin belly armor directly to whatever German Panzerfaust team happened to be waiting on the other side. During an informal bull session in his tank battalion, a soldier from Tennessee half-joked that someone should weld saw teeth onto the front of the tank and just cut straight through the hedges instead of climbing them. Most of the men laughed it off. Cullen didn't. He went out to the wreckage on the invasion beaches, salvaged steel from the German Czech hedgehog anti-landing obstacles littering the sand, cut it into prongs, and welded them onto the bow of a Sherman himself. He demonstrated it for his own battalion commander, and on July 14th, General Omar Bradley personally came to watch a modified Sherman accelerate into a hedge bank and drive straight through it rather than over it, its belly never exposed. Bradley ordered immediate mass production. By the launch of Operation Cobra on July 25th, roughly 500 of these Rhino devices had been welded onto American tanks across Normandy. A liquor salesman with a welding torch solving, in about 2 weeks, a tactical problem an entire army group had otherwise been throwing infantry battalions at for 6. Where did that specific reflex actually come from, if not from any manual? American doctrine on paper, if anything, told sergeants what to do in more prescriptive detail than German manuals ever bothered with. The American Officer Corps of 1939 had been small, underfunded, and rigidly hierarchical, nothing like the Prussian tradition Auftragstaktik grew out of. But American sergeants in 1944 weren't really operating off the manual at all. They were products of something the manual could never have captured on paper. A country that had spent a century and a half teaching its young men, almost by accident, that they didn't need to ask permission first. Volunteer fire departments, pick-up baseball games organized in vacant lots with no adult supervising. Farm boys running the family combine unsupervised from the age of 14. Mechanics who'd already taken apart a Model T engine on the kitchen table more than once. Construction crews who'd raised a barn in a weekend with no formal architectural drawing anywhere in sight. Put a man carrying that specific set of habits into uniform and hand him a rifle, and the manual largely receded on its own. The rifle just became another tool, the objective in front of him just another barn that needed building, and he did the thing the situation in front of him actually required. German society hadn't produced anything like that cultural input. A German teenager coming of age in the 1930s had been raised to treat obedience to legitimate authority as a genuine moral virtue, inside a state that had spent a decade systematically insisting the Führer did the thinking for the whole nation. Whatever Auftragstaktik training the same young man eventually received sat as a doctrinal overlay on top of a cultural foundation running in the exact opposite direction. He could absolutely be taught, formally, that initiative was expected of him, while every other signal in his daily life told him initiative was a genuinely dangerous thing for a man holding no rank. A line that's circulated for decades, sometimes attributed to an unnamed post-war German general, captures the same idea in a single sentence, that the American army does so well in wartime because war is chaos, and the American army practices chaos on a daily basis. It's usually repeated as a joke or a backhanded compliment. Whoever actually said it first was reaching for something genuinely real, the experience of fighting a force that looked from the outside like total disorder, and that kept producing coordinated tactical results out of that disorder anyway. The Germans had built a doctrine that aspired toward exactly this kind of productive chaos. The Americans, without ever reading Moltke, had simply been raised inside it. That still leaves an obvious question hanging. If German doctrine was this flexible and this far ahead of everyone else on paper, why was it visibly failing by 1944? The manual hadn't changed. What had changed was what was left of the men trained to execute it. Compare two German divisions, not on paper, but in what actually filled them out by that point in the war. The 21st Panzer Division, rebuilt in time for D-Day after fighting in France in 1940, still carried an officer corps genuinely shaped by Auftragstaktik. Junior officers trained in the 1930s when the German military still had years to develop them properly. Sergeants with a decade or more in uniform, captains who'd served in Poland, France, and the Eastern Front, and had the doctrine genuinely written into their instincts by that point. A 21st Panzer platoon leader handed an objective in 1944 could generally be trusted to work out how to take it, because he'd been doing exactly that for 5 years running. Now set that against the 352nd Infantry Division, the formation actually defending Omaha the same morning Carlton Barrett was dragging wounded men out of the surf. Formed in November 1943, barely 7 months old by D-Day, its core built out of shattered units shipped back from a front where the average German infantry division's life expectancy ran in months rather than years. Its junior officers were a patchwork of Eastern Front survivors and green replacements, plenty of them promoted far faster than 1939 standards would ever have allowed, simply because there was nobody more experienced left to promote instead. This was the story across the entire German army by the middle of 1944. By rough wartime estimates, the Wehrmacht had absorbed something on the order of 3 million casualties on the Eastern Front alone by the time of D-Day, and the men who die first in any army built around leading from the front are, almost by definition, the men actually doing the leading from the front. Two things were killing Auftragstaktik at once, and together they were worse than either alone. The first was straightforward attrition. Each successful company commander who exposed himself to genuinely read a changing situation and got killed doing it was replaced by a man with no comparable frontline experience, more likely either to die the same way or to default to rigidly following the written order instead, for lack of the seasoning to trust his own judgment. The second was Hitler himself. In the war's early years, German High Command had largely let its field marshals fight their own battles. Given a mission, trusted to work out how to accomplish it. That trust began eroding after the first serious reverses on the Eastern Front in 1942, and by 1944 had inverted completely. The infamous no withdrawal without my permission orders, the obsessive micromanagement radiating out from the wolf's lair, the pattern of firing any general who displayed too much independent judgment, Manstein and Rundstedt both dismissed and recalled and dismissed again over the following years. A German divisional commander by 1944 could no longer be confident that showing initiative would be rewarded, only that a wrong call might end his career, and that waiting for an explicit order from above was, in every practical sense, the safer choice. Between the two, dead veterans replaced by inexperienced survivors, and a dictator systematically punishing the exact judgment his own doctrine depended on, the German command system had become, by the time the Western Allies landed in France, the mirror opposite of what it was built to be. The cruel irony sitting right alongside that collapse is that the American command system was simultaneously loosening in the opposite direction, and doing it entirely by accident. Nobody had read Moltke. Most American officers had never even heard the term Auftragstaktik. American sergeants simply kept improvising on their own, getting away with it, and a young, rapidly promoted, thoroughly war-built American officer corps kept noticing that letting them do it consistently produced results. So they let them keep doing it. There was no conscious, top-down decision behind any of this. It was a straightforward feedback loop. The Army wrote fewer detailed orders because the men increasingly didn't need them, and the men needed them less because the orders had gradually turned into something closer to trust. By December 1944, that inversion was essentially complete, and it produced its most famous single expression at a small Belgian crossroads town the German Army had just fully surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division reached Bastogne in the first place because of one of the more improvised reactions of the entire war, pulled out of reserve in France mid-refit when the Ardennes offensive broke through on December 16th, on trucks within hours and driving through freezing weather toward a town most of the men had never heard of, without its own commanding general, who happened to be in Washington at the time, and without any clear orders about what exactly to do once they arrived. Acting command fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, an artillery officer by training, suddenly responsible for a division-sized defense of a critical road junction with 3 separate German corps converging on it from multiple directions at once. McAuliffe didn't wait for further instructions. He looked at the map, recognized Bastogne as the road hub the German drive on Antwerp actually needed, decided his job was simply to deny it to them regardless of what came next, set up a perimeter, and then largely got out of the way of his own battalion commanders, who got out of the way of their company commanders, who got out of the way of their platoon leaders, who, as often as not, got out of the way of the sergeants actually deciding, in real time, which foxholes to dig and which tree lines to defend, and when a shape moving through the falling snow was probably American troops returning from a forward position rather than German infantry. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers walked into the American perimeter under a white flag carrying a written ultimatum demanding surrender within 2 hours or facing total annihilation by artillery. McAuliffe read it and, by the account of the men present, said something close to a private "oh, nuts," almost to himself, before asking his staff what he should actually write back. His own operations officer suggested his first reaction had already been pretty good. The formal reply went out on a single sheet. To the German commander, nuts the American commander. The German officers receiving it genuinely didn't understand the word, and had to have it explained to them as an emphatic refusal by the American officer who delivered it. An army built around formally channeled surrenders and refusals had simply never encountered a reply quite like this one, composed on a single general's own authority, with no consultation upward. In language, no military regulation on either side of the front had ever contemplated. Bastogne held. Patton's Third Army, executing its own genuinely remarkable improvisation, a 90-degree pivot of 3 full divisions in winter conditions inside less than 72 hours, broke through to the perimeter the day after Christmas, and the German offensive collapsed. If your own father or grandfather served anywhere in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theater, I'd genuinely like to read whatever you know about their service in the comments. Unit, location, whatever pieces of the story survive in family letters or photographs, because those small, specific personal details are frequently the actual historical record in places where the official archives simply went silent. What finally makes this whole pattern legible isn't anything either side wrote down publicly during the war itself. It comes from a British intelligence operation that stayed classified for decades afterward. Beginning in 1942, senior German officers captured on various fronts were held at a converted country estate north of London called Trent Park. Conditions there were genuinely comfortable enough that the prisoners themselves believed they'd landed in one of the better postings available to a captured general. Decent food, generous exercise privileges, chess sets, the run of the grounds. What none of them knew was that virtually every room in the house, bedrooms and lavatories included, had been wired for sound. British intelligence officers, a significant number of them German Jewish refugees who'd fled the Reich themselves before the war, sat in a basement transcribing every conversation those generals had with each other, around the clock, for years. The resulting transcripts run to something on the order of 150,000 pages. They remain one of the more genuinely valuable sources historians have for what senior German officers actually believe privately, as distinct from what they'd later choose to write in carefully curated post-war memoirs. In those bugged conversations, the recurring question of why the war was actually going wrong for Germany comes up constantly. And what's genuinely striking is what these officers didn't spend much time blaming, at least while they thought nobody outside the room was listening. Not American material superiority, not nearly to the degree their post-war memoirs would later claim. Not Allied air power, not nearly as much as their public statements after the war suggested. What they kept circling back to instead, uncomfortably and repeatedly, was something closer to genuine bewilderment about the nature of the American soldier himself. One general captured in Tunisia told a fellow prisoner in 1944 that he'd personally interrogated a number of American prisoners and simply couldn't categorize them. They behaved, in his account, as individuals, holding actual opinions, arguing openly with one another, joking freely about their own officers. And yet, on the battlefield, they displayed what he called an instinct for the situation he'd never once witnessed among his own conscripts. He couldn't reconcile the two observations inside his own framework. The entire German military tradition had been built on the premise that individuality had to be actively subordinated to the unit for a force to fight effectively at all, and the Americans appeared to be violating that premise and somehow benefiting from the violation anyway. Another prisoner, a panzer commander, described watching a single American tank platoon, 4 vehicles, no officer present at all, only a senior sergeant riding in the lead tank, outmaneuver an entire German company using a sequence of moves he said followed no military logic he could actually identify, and that worked regardless. Asked by another prisoner how that was even possible, his answer drifted into something close to philosophy, that the Americans seemed to be a different kind of soldier entirely. Not better trained, he was careful to specify, not braver, not more disciplined, but freer, a word he kept turning over as though he hadn't yet found a more precise one to replace it with. A third officer, in a separate conversation recorded that same year, was considerably blunter about it. The German army, he said, had spent 100 years teaching itself that an officer's job was to think and a soldier's job was to obey, that the highest compliment available for a German soldier was that he had carried out his orders with precision. The Americans had simply broken that entire rule, he said, and appeared to be winning the war partly because of it. In a conversation he genuinely believed was private, he said the American soldier didn't need to be told what to do because he'd been raised in a country that had never taught him to wait in the first place, while the German soldier was still waiting for a permission that had, by that point in the war, largely stopped arriving. None of that made it into any post-war German memoir. It's one of the more honestly self-critical assessments any senior German officer produced about his own army's collapse, and it only survives because he had no idea a microphone was running. I don't think these officers were entirely wrong about themselves, even accounting for how uncomfortable the admission clearly was. Auftragstaktik really had been, and still is, one of the genuine achievements of modern military thought. What failed wasn't the doctrine, it was the trust underneath it. The one thing Germany's own political system had spent 2 years quietly destroying, and the one thing the Americans, without ever naming it, had never actually had to build. The German officers scattered along that thin line in the Ardennes that December weren't actually watching an American squad operating without orders at all. They were watching men who had absorbed their dead lieutenant's intent so completely and understood what the wider battle actually required so clearly that they no longer needed anyone to spell it out for them in the moment. Nobody outranked anybody else in any way that mattered in that particular field. All of them, in a real sense, outranked the situation itself. And that's the part no German doctrinal vocabulary of the period had room for. German officers could imagine an army with no commander at all. That was simply a mob, a familiar and containable failure mode. They could imagine an army with one commander directing everything from above. That was an ordinary unit, equally familiar. What they'd never built a category for was an army in which the man at the very bottom had been trusted so completely with the intent of the man at the very top that the practical gap between the two had essentially collapsed. That isn't a military formation in any sense German training recognized. It's closer to a culture. And cultures can't be issued as an order from above. They have to grow on their own, over generations, mostly without anyone planning them on purpose. Carlton Barrett was real and lived until 1986. Curtis Cullen was real and was badly wounded himself later that same summer during the Cobra breakout, losing part of a leg, though he survived the war. Max Schneider was real. Leo van de Voort was real. Anthony McAuliffe's single word really was written exactly as delivered. Most of the men who actually made these specific, unauthorized calls under fire never appear in any standard textbook at all. Plenty of them died young or came home afterward to entirely ordinary civilian jobs and simply never talked much about any of it, remembered eventually by a headstone listing a unit, a date, and a service number, rather than the specific thing they'd actually done. The German officers recorded at Trent Park never quite landed on the right word for what they'd been fighting. They reached for free, for individual, for instinct, and none of those words was ever fully adequate on its own. But all of them were pointing, however imprecisely, toward the same underlying thing. A kind of soldiering their own doctrine had spent a century trying to engineer and purpose, and had just watched an army that never wrote the manual produce almost by accident instead.